The universe has a peculiar sense of humor, and Dr. Elena Vasquez was about to become the punchline of its greatest joke. On the morning of March 15, 2387, she stood in her cramped laboratory kitchen aboard research station Kepler-7, staring at what could generously be called the most pathetic excuse for a meal in the known galaxy. The synthesized protein paste had achieved a consistency somewhere between wet concrete and despair, and the hydroponic lettuce had wilted into something that looked like it had given up on life entirely. Elena had always been unremarkable in every sense that mattered to the Galactic Council. At 34, she was a mid-level xenobiologist working for the Terran Research Consortium, specializing in the dietary habits of sentient species across the galaxy. Her work was considered so mundane that even her own supervisor, Dr. Harrison Webb, had once fallen asleep during her presentation on the nutritional requirements of Rigelian moss farmers. She had brown hair that refused to cooperate with any styling attempt, wore thick-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down her nose, and possessed the kind of forgettable face that made her invisible in crowds. But Elena had one trait that would prove more valuable than any amount of charisma or conventional brilliance: an absolute, pathological inability to give up on anything she considered important. It was this trait that had led her to spend the last 3 years developing what she called Project Sustenance, a foolishly ambitious attempt to create a single food item that could nourish any carbon-based lifeform in the galaxy. The galaxy was vast, containing over 4 billion inhabited worlds and approximately 847,000 known sentient species. Each species had evolved different digestive systems, metabolic requirements, and nutritional needs. What sustained a crystalline Arcturus native could poison a methane-breathing Titan colonist. The logistics of feeding diverse crews on long-haul space missions had become a nightmare of specialized food synthesis units, cultural dietary restrictions, and expensive shipping costs. Most researchers considered the problem unsolvable. Elena considered it Tuesday. She had been working alone in her laboratory for months, surviving on caffeine pills and stubborn determination, when she made the discovery that would reshape the fundamental balance of power in the galaxy. It happened, as most world-changing events do, entirely by accident. The synthesizer had malfunctioned again, producing what should have been simple bread but, instead creating something that defied several laws of physics and at least one law of common sense. The substance appeared to be bread, but Elena's instruments detected molecular structures that shouldn't exist, protein chains that folded in impossible ways, and an energy signature that made her equipment emit confused beeping sounds. Any reasonable scientist would have disposed of the anomalous matter and filed a maintenance request. Elena, however, had not eaten a proper meal in 18 hours and was operating on the kind of sleep deprivation that makes people make extraordinarily poor decisions. She took a bite. The taste was indescribable. Not because it was particularly delicious, but because it somehow tasted exactly like whatever the person eating it most needed to taste at that moment. For Elena, exhausted and homesick, it tasted like the peanut butter and strawberry jam sandwiches her grandmother used to make during summer afternoons in rural Mexico, complete with the slightly burnt edges from the old toaster and the way the jam would leak out the sides. But taste was only the beginning. Within minutes, Elena felt more energized than she had in months. Her chronic back pain from hunching over laboratory equipment simply vanished. The persistent headache she'd carried for weeks evaporated. Even her vision seemed clearer, though she was still wearing her glasses. Over the following days, Elena ran every test she could think of on the mysterious bread. The results were impossible. The substance appeared to automatically adjust its molecular composition based on the biochemistry of whatever organism consumed it. It provided perfect nutrition for any lifeform, healed minor injuries, boosted immune systems, and even seemed to improve cognitive function. It was as if the bread somehow read the consumer's biology and transformed itself into exactly what that being needed most. Elena named it adaptive nutritional matter, though she privately thought of it as magic bread. She spent weeks trying to replicate the synthesizer malfunction that had created it, documenting every variable, every power fluctuation, every microscopic deviation in the manufacturing process. The breakthrough came when she realized the malfunction hadn't been random, it had been triggered by the unique electromagnetic signature of her own stress-induced biorhythms interacting with a solar flare from Kepler-7's host star. She could make more magic bread. More importantly, she could make it consistently. Elena faced a choice that would determine not just her own future, but the future of galactic civilization itself. She could publish her findings, submit them to peer review, and watch as the Galactic Council's bureaucracy slowly strangled her discovery in red tape while pharmaceutical corporations and food conglomerates fought over the rights to mass-produce her creation. Or she could keep quiet and do something that had never been attempted in recorded history: create a monopoly on the most valuable substance in the galaxy. The decision should have been obvious. Elena was a scientist, trained to share knowledge for the betterment of all sentient life. She believed in collaboration, peer review, and the free exchange of information. But Elena also remembered what had happened to Dr. Marcus Chen when he discovered the cure for Proxima Plague, how the pharmaceutical cartels had buried his research for 40 years to protect their treatment profits, letting billions suffer while they maintained their market dominance. Elena made magic bread. Then, she made more. And more. Within 6 months, she had quietly resigned from the Terran Research Consortium and established a small company called Galactic Nutrition Solutions. She rented a warehouse on the outer rim world of Epsilon Ceti and began small-scale production of what she marketed as universal food supplement. She was careful to downplay its capabilities in her initial advertising, describing it simply as an efficient nutrition source suitable for most humanoid species. Her first customers were budget-conscious freight haulers looking to reduce the cost of feeding diverse crews on long runs. Word spread slowly through the transportation networks: there was this new food that actually worked for everyone, tasted good, and cost less than maintaining separate synthesis units for different species. Elena reinvested every credit she earned back into expanding production. She hired a small team of technicians, sworn to secrecy with contracts that would bankrupt them if they revealed her manufacturing process. She established distribution networks on a dozen worlds, always staying small enough to avoid regulatory attention but growing steadily month by month. The transformation of Elena herself was gradual but profound. The shy, overlooked scientist began to understand the true scope of what she controlled. She wasn't just making food, she was controlling the most fundamental human need across the entire galaxy. Every being that consumed her product became dependent on her continued production. Every world that incorporated her food into their supply chains gave her leverage over their population's well-being. By the end of her first year in business, Elena had achieved something unprecedented. She had created a product that was simultaneously the most valuable and most strategically important substance in known space. Governments didn't yet understand what she controlled, because they still fought in terms of weapons and territory. Elena controlled something far more fundamental: she controlled hunger itself. The woman who had once been invisible had become the most powerful person in the galaxy. She just hadn't announced it yet. Part 2, The Empire of Sustenance. 3 years after that first accidental bite of impossible bread, Elena Vasquez stood before the mirror in her private chambers aboard the space station she now called home. The reflection showed a woman transformed. Gone were the thick glasses, replaced by corrective surgery that had given her perfect vision. Her hair, once unmanageable brown, now fell in elegant waves of silver-streaked black. She wore clothes that cost more than most people earned in a year, but, more importantly, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how much power she wielded. Her space station, christened Providence, orbited no world and belonged to no government. It was a massive structure, larger than most cities, housing the production facilities that now fed over 2 billion beings across 40,000 worlds. Elena had designed Providence herself, incorporating defensive systems that would make most military commanders weep with envy. But her greatest defense wasn't weapons, it was hunger. The man sitting across from her desk represented the Galactic Council's latest attempt to bring her under their control. Ambassador Theron Voss was a career diplomat from the core worlds, accustomed to negotiating with heads of state and corporate overlords. He had arrived expecting to deal with a small-time food manufacturer who had gotten too successful for her own good. What he found instead was a woman who spoke with the casual authority of someone who could starve civilizations if she chose to. Dr. Vasquez, Ambassador Voss began, consulting his notes with the confidence of a man who believed bureaucracy could solve any problem. The Council has received numerous reports about your unusual business practices. There are concerns about monopolistic behavior, price manipulation, and failure to comply with standard galactic trade regulations. Elena smiled, an expression that had once been warm and genuine but now carried undertones that made experienced negotiators nervous. Ambassador, I appreciate the Council's concern. However, I believe there may be some confusion about the nature of our relationship. She gestured to the viewport behind her desk, which showed the vast expanse of space dotted with the lights of cargo ships arriving and departing from Providence. Those ships represent supply lines to worlds across the galaxy. The Regelian colonies, the Centauri mining stations, the research outposts in the Vale Nebula. They all depend on my production to feed their populations. If I were to shut down operations tomorrow, what do you think would happen? Voss shifted uncomfortably. The Council's analysts had run those projections, and the results were sobering. Elena's universal food supplement had become so integrated into galactic supply chains that its sudden disappearance would trigger famine on hundreds of worlds within weeks. Dr. Vasquez, surely you understand that such concentration of control over basic necessities is precisely why the Galactic Trade Commission exists. We have regulations designed to prevent what, exactly? Elena interrupted, her voice taking on an edge that made the temperature in the room seem to drop several degrees. To prevent a single human woman from becoming too successful? To ensure that essential resources remain under the control of the same cartels and bureaucracies that have mismanaged galactic supply chains for centuries? Elena stood and walked to a wall display that showed real-time data from across her distribution network. Let me show you what I've accomplished in 3 years, Ambassador. Malnutrition rates on frontier worlds have dropped by 78%. Food-related diseases have virtually disappeared in populations with access to my products. The cost of feeding diverse crews on exploration missions has decreased by 60%, enabling expansion into previously unreachable sectors. The display showed dozens of graphs and statistics, each one representing millions of lives improved by Elena's intervention in galactic food systems. Furthermore, Elena continued, my production methods are entirely sustainable. No environmental degradation, no exploitation of agricultural worlds, no transportation of resources across vast distances. I have solved problems that the Galactic Council has been unsuccessfully addressing for centuries. Ambassador Voss cleared his throat. Nevertheless, Dr. Vasquez, the concentration of such power in the hands of a single individual is inherently dangerous. What assurances can you provide that your benevolent dictatorship will remain benevolent? Elena turned back to face him, and Voss suddenly understood why his briefing materials had warned him about this woman's presence. There was something in her eyes that suggested she had already considered questions far more complex than anything he was prepared to ask. Ambassador, let me tell you about weakness, Elena said, settling back into her chair. For 34 years, I was weak. I was overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed by people who confused loudness with leadership and bureaucracy with competence. I accepted that weakness because I believed it was my natural state. She touched a control on her desk, and the room's lighting dimmed slightly, making her seem to glow with an inner light. But weakness is a choice, Ambassador. It's a decision to accept limitations imposed by others rather than recognizing the power you already possess. Every day I spent in that research station, convinced I was insignificant, I was already carrying within me the potential to reshape galactic civilization. The only thing that changed was my willingness to act on that potential. Elena's voice took on the cadence of someone who had spent long hours thinking about fundamental questions of power and responsibility. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has already eliminated the vulnerabilities they would exploit. I destroyed the weak Elena Vasquez who accepted other people's definitions of her limitations. What remains is someone who understands her own power and how to use it responsibly. Ambassador Voss felt increasingly uncomfortable as he realized this conversation was not proceeding according to any scenario his diplomatic training had prepared him for. Dr. Vasquez, the Council is prepared to offer very generous terms for bringing your operations under regulatory oversight. We're not talking about shutting down your business, merely ensuring appropriate safeguards. Ambassador, Elena said quietly, let me save us both some time. Return to the Council and deliver this message. Elena Vasquez controls the production of the most essential resource in the galaxy. She has no interest in submitting to the authority of institutions that have proven themselves incompetent at managing the problems she has solved. However, she is willing to continue providing her services to any world or organization that treats her with appropriate respect. She leaned forward slightly. And, Ambassador? Make sure they understand that appropriate respect includes not sending diplomats to threaten me with regulatory action. The next person who tries to treat me like a small business owner who needs to be brought to heel might find their homeworld experiencing unexpected supply chain difficulties. The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that it took Voss several seconds to process what he had just heard. Elena was politely informing him that she was prepared to use starvation as a weapon against any government that opposed her. Dr. Vasquez, surely you're not suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, Ambassador. I'm stating a fact. I control something every world needs. That gives me leverage, and leverage properly applied becomes power. The Council can choose to work with me as a partner, or they can discover what happens when the supply of universal food supplement to their core world suddenly becomes unreliable. Elena stood again, indicating that the meeting was over. Please convey my regards to the Council, Ambassador Voss. And do remind them that weakness is a choice. They can choose to remain weak and dependent on my continued goodwill, or they can find ways to become strong enough to merit my partnership. As Ambassador Voss gathered his materials and prepared to leave, Elena added one final comment that would be reported back to the Galactic Council within hours. Oh, and, Ambassador? Tell them Elena Vasquez is no longer the woman they remember from their files. That woman was destroyed by her own hand, and what replaced her is something they're not prepared to understand yet. The door closed behind the departing diplomat, and Elena returned to her desk. Through the viewport, she could see the steady stream of cargo ships carrying her products to worlds across the galaxy. Each ship represented another thread in the web of dependency she had carefully constructed. Elena had begun her transformation by destroying the weak version of herself that accepted others' limitations. Now she was ready to begin the next phase, teaching the galaxy what true strength looked like when it was wielded by someone who understood the difference between power and responsibility. The weak Elena would have been horrified by the woman she had become. The strong Elena understood that horror was simply another form of weakness that needed to be discarded. Part 3, The Architecture of Power. 5 years after the diplomatic incident that became known as the Voss Ultimatum, the galaxy had reorganized itself around a simple reality: Elena Vasquez owned the stars, and everyone else was renting space. The transformation had not been violent. Elena had never deployed weapons, never conquered territory, never declared war on any world or government. She had simply continued making her impossible bread while systematically eliminating every alternative food source that could challenge her monopoly. When competing manufacturers attempted to reverse engineer her formula, they found their key scientists recruited away by offers they couldn't refuse. When agricultural cartels tried to undercut her prices, they discovered that their financing had mysteriously dried up through a network of shell companies and economic pressure. Elena had learned that violence was the tool of the weak. The strong simply made alternatives impossible. From her command center aboard Providence, now a space station the size of a small moon, Elena monitored the pulse of galactic civilization. The walls displayed real-time data streams from 47,000 worlds, tracking everything from population health statistics to political stability indices. She had become the invisible governor of an empire built not on territory but on necessity. The woman who stared out at the stars bore little resemblance to the laboratory researcher who had once worried about making rent. Elena's hair had gone completely silver, not from age but from the accumulated stress of managing the survival of billions of beings. Her clothes were simple but perfectly tailored, expressing power through understated elegance rather than ostentation. But the most striking change was in her presence itself. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had internalized the knowledge that entire civilizations continued to exist because she chose to let them. The transformation of Elena Vasquez was complete, but the galaxy was still learning what that meant. Her personal assistant, Commander Sarah Chen, approached with the day's briefings. Chen was a former military officer who had understood what Elena represented before most governments figured it out. She had requested transfer to Providence 3 years earlier, recognizing that the future belonged to whoever controlled the infrastructure of survival itself. Dr. Vasquez, we have 3 items requiring your attention, Chen reported with the efficiency of someone who had learned to present complex galactic politics in digestible summaries. First, the Andromedian Trade Union is requesting permission to establish distribution centers in their territory. Second, the Core Worlds Parliament has passed a resolution condemning our economic imperialism and threatens to develop alternative food sources. Third, there are reports of a new religious movement that worships you as the provider of sustenance. Elena turned from the starscape to face her assistant. What's the status of Andromedan food security without our products? Current stockpiles would last approximately 6 weeks before widespread malnutrition begins affecting their outer colonies, Chen replied without consulting her notes. Their agricultural infrastructure was damaged in the recent meteor strikes, and they lack the industrial capacity to rebuild before the next growing season. Grant their request, Elena said. But, include the standard dependency clauses. Any attempt to reverse engineer our products or develop competitive alternatives voids the distribution agreement immediately. She moved to her desk, where a holographic display showed the political structure of the core worlds. As for the Parliament's resolution, how many of their member worlds currently rely on our products for more than 40% of their caloric intake? 37 out of 42 worlds, Chen responded. Elena smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone watching a chess opponent realize they had walked into checkmate. File a formal response expressing regret at the Parliament's hostile stance. Then, reduce shipments to core worlds by 15% for the next 3 months. Cite manufacturing delays and increased demand from more cooperative trading partners. The reduction would not cause starvation, but it would trigger food price increases and political pressure that would make the Parliament's grandstanding untenable. Elena had learned to calibrate her responses with surgical precision, enough pressure to change behavior, not enough to justify desperate measures. And the religious movement? Elena asked. Chen hesitated slightly. They call themselves the Church of Sustenance. They believe you're a divine figure sent to end hunger across the galaxy. Their membership is growing rapidly, particularly on worlds where your products have eliminated famine. There are reports of shrines dedicated to you, and some adherents refuse to eat anything that doesn't come from Providence. Elena was quiet for a long moment, contemplating the unexpected consequences of her choices. She had sought to control food distribution. She had not intended to become a religious figure. But power, she had learned, created its own mythology whether she desired it or not. Monitor the movement but don't interfere, she decided. Religious devotion is just another form of dependency, and dependency serves our purposes. However, if they begin advocating for direct worship or claim to speak for me, we'll need to correct those misconceptions. The irony was not lost on Elena. The weak version of herself would have been horrified at being worshipped. The strong version understood that reverence was simply another tool of control, neither good nor evil but useful when properly managed. Commander Chen departed to implement these decisions, leaving Elena alone with the weight of her transformation. She walked to the memorial wall she had constructed in her private chambers, not a monument to the dead, but to the discarded aspects of her former self. Pictures of Dr. Elena Vasquez, the overlooked researcher. Academic papers she had written when she still believed in peer review and collaborative science. A small laboratory instrument she had kept from her days on Kepler 7, now displayed like an artifact from a lost civilization. Elena touched the surface of her old identification badge, remembering the woman who had worn it. That Elena had been kind, optimistic, and naive. She had believed that good intentions and hard work would be enough to make positive change in the galaxy. She had accepted her place in the hierarchy of scientific research, never questioning why her innovations were ignored while lesser minds received recognition and resources. The destruction of that Elena had been necessary and complete. In her place stood something unprecedented in galactic history, a human who had transcended the artificial limitations imposed by governments, corporations, and social hierarchies. Elena had discovered that the difference between the powerless and the omnipotent was simply the willingness to act on the power that already existed within reach. The galaxy called her many things now. Economic dictator. Benevolent tyrant. The Provider. The Sustainer of Worlds. Food Empress. Most who used these titles understood neither the full scope of her power nor the philosophical journey that had created it. Elena preferred to think of herself simply as someone who had learned the fundamental truth that weakness and strength were choices rather than circumstances. Every day, beings across the galaxy made the choice to accept dependence on her products rather than developing alternatives. Every day, governments made the choice to negotiate with her rather than risk the consequences of opposition. Every day, entire civilizations chose to structure their societies around the assumption that Elena Vasquez would continue providing what they needed to survive. These were all choices that reinforced her power because they were made by those who had not yet destroyed their own weakness. Looking out at the stars that now comprised her domain, Elena reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. The transformation had begun with a simple recognition: she had been accepting limitations that existed only in her own mind. The woman who had worried about supervisor approval and peer recognition had possessed the same capabilities as the woman who now controlled galactic food distribution. The difference was not in ability but in the willingness to act on that ability without permission from others. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, because he has eliminated the vulnerabilities that external force can exploit. Elena had destroyed every aspect of herself that sought approval, acceptance, or validation from institutions and individuals who had proven themselves unworthy of such deference. What remained was pure function, a human being operating at full capacity, unencumbered by the social conditioning that taught people to minimize their own power in service of maintaining systems that served them poorly. Elena Vasquez had become the most powerful individual in galactic history not through conquest or inheritance, but through the simple expedient of refusing to remain small. She controlled the galaxy because she had first learned to control herself, eliminating the weakness that made control by others possible. Standing in her command center, surrounded by the data streams of a civilization that existed at her sufferance, Elena understood that her transformation was complete. She was no longer the woman who had stumbled upon impossible bread in a broken synthesizer. She had become something that transcended individual identity, the living embodiment of power properly understood and correctly applied. The galaxy would continue to evolve around this new reality, learning to function within the parameters she established. Governments would adapt their policies to maintain her favor. Corporations would restructure their operations to complement rather than compete with her empire. Billions of beings would wake each morning knowing that their continued survival depended on the goodwill of a woman who had learned to shed every trace of the weakness that had once defined her. Elena had eaten a sandwich that changed everything, but the transformation that mattered was not in the bread itself. It was in the recognition that she had always possessed the power to reshape galactic civilization; she had simply been too weak to use it. The destruction of that weakness had been the most important meal of her life, nourishing not her body but her understanding of what she was capable of becoming. The stars belonged to Elena Vasquez now, not because she had taken them, but because she had finally stopped pretending she didn't deserve them. End of documentation. Author's note: this document represents a synthesis of eyewitness accounts, economic data, and psychological analysis compiled from multiple sources across the galactic communication network. The transformation of Dr. Elena Vasquez from insignificant researcher to galactic hegemon serves as a case study in the relationship between individual psychological development and systemic power structures. Her statement that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others has become a foundational principle in the emerging field of applied power dynamics, though its implications for galactic civilization remain a subject of ongoing debate among political theorists and social scientists. The bread itself remains impossible to replicate without access to Elena's proprietary manufacturing process, ensuring the continuation of the dependency relationships that have fundamentally altered the balance of power among sentient species. Whether this represents evolution or degradation of galactic civilization depends largely on one's perspective regarding the relationship between individual autonomy and collective security. Elena Vasquez continues to operate from Providence Station, where she maintains direct control over the sustenance of approximately 4.7 billion beings across the known galaxy. Her transformation from weak to strong appears to be irreversible, suggesting that the current power structure will persist until another individual undergoes a similar psychological evolution, or until Elena herself chooses to step down from her position as the galaxy's primary life-sustaining force. The sandwich changed everything, but only because the woman who ate it was finally ready to become who she had always been capable of being.